Next decision is to choose an image size. Image size is measured in pixels, and the greater the number of pixels, the better the image quality will be. On the D90, large images are 12.2 megapixels, medium images are 6.9 megapixels, and small images are 3.1 megapixels, which is still pretty big. But the large setting is almost always going to be the best choice. After all, the camera's high resolution is one of the reasons you bought it. My philosophy has always been that if it's worth shooting right. You can always make a large file smaller, but you can't make a small file bigger without a significant loss of quality. So, at this point, we've set the camera to record images with the JPEG fine quality setting and the large file size. That should really be your default settings for almost anything you shoot. However, there are a few advanced controls that can be used to further fine-tune the quality and style of your images. As I said earlier, there are 11 shooting modes on the D90, and we can divide them into two groups: the advanced modes and the point-and-shoot modes. We'll talk more about these modes later in the next chapter, but I wanted to remind you about them now, because the next picture quality settings I'm going to show you are only available in the 4 advanced modes. In the point-and-shoot modes, the camera sets them automatically. The first menu is called Set Picture Control, and it offers advanced control over sharpness, contrast, brightness, saturation, and hue. There are 6 presets, plus the option to fine-tune each one of them manually. Standard is the default setting and provides balanced, middle-of-the-road results. This is the best choice for most shooting. Neutral offers minimal in-camera processing and is the best choice if you will be extensively retouching your photos later on the computer. But if that's the case, you might want to consider shooting RAW instead. Vivid provides stronger, more vibrant primary colors. Monochrome reduces the color saturation to 0 so that you can take photos in black and white. Portrait lowers contrast and softens the sharpening to smooth out skin texture and hide minor blemishes. And Landscape is designed for outdoor shooting. So which of the 6 picture controls do I recommend you use? Well, that depends on you. If you're the kind of person who is going to load the images into your computer and do some image enhancements, such as sharpening and contrast adjustments, before you print your pictures, then I suggest either leaving it on standard or neutral. But if you plan on printing directly out of the camera, or if you simply don't want to be bothered with making adjustments on a computer, then go ahead and choose the setting that seems to go along best with whatever you're shooting. Vivid is my favorite setting if I'm not going to be editing on the computer. Another menu that is only available when you're using one of the 4 advanced shooting modes is called Active D-Lighting. Active D-Lighting attempts to preserve details in highlights and shadows, thus creating images with an improved contrast range. There are 4 levels to choose from that will control how strongly the effect is applied: plus off, and of course automatic. Because the results of these settings are all subjective, I'll leave it up to you to do some experimenting of your own to see what looks better to you. But this is one of the few settings on the D90 that I actually leave on auto. Now, as handy as all this in-camera processing can be, in my opinion, the best approach is not to go too far with it. Keep the image manipulation to a minimum, and instead use an image editing program on your computer where you have much more control. Plus, on the computer, you can easily undo anything that you don't like. As with any digital camera, once the D90 processes your photos internally, you've got to live with the results, whether you like them or not. The final thing I want to cover in this chapter is dust. One hazard of removing the lens from any digital SLR is that it exposes the inside of the camera to dust that could show up later as specks on your pictures. Fortunately, the D90 has an effective anti-dust system to fight this problem. But unfortunately, Nikon has it turned off by default. So, let's go turn it on. Press the menu button Go to the Setup menu page and choose Clean Image Sensor. If you suspect that you've got a dust problem right now, you can set the camera down, sitting upright on a level surface, and choose Clean Now. The camera will vibrate the filter in front of the image sensor briefly to shake off any dust, and hopefully that will fix the problem. But if you're like me and change lenses all the time, thus increasing the chances of getting dust into the camera, I suggest that you choose one of these three options for routine automated cleaning of the sensor. It's not 100% perfect, but at least it improves the odds of fixing a dust problem before it's too late. You can have the camera clean the sensor at startup, at shutdown, or both. I prefer clean at startup, but the choice is yours. One of the most important parts of shooting great photographs is getting the exposure right. Even though you might be able to use a computer later to try and compensate for bad exposure, there's just no substitute for getting it right in the camera. Now, as I said at the beginning of this workshop, I'm going to assume you already understand what shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are, and how they interact to affect the exposure. Not to mention how they can be used to change the look, style, and quality of your pictures. But if you feel like you need more information, let me again recommend the Magic Lantern DVD called Great Photos with Your Digital SLR, or any of the general digital photography books published by Lark Books. I like to explain exposure by breaking it down into three parts. First, you need to decide which of the 11 shooting modes you're going to use. Second, if you choose one of the 4 advanced shooting modes, then you also have to tell the camera how you want it to meter the scene. Metering is how the camera decides what the best exposure settings should be just before it snaps the shutter. And third, there are a couple of minor controls that you can use to fine-tune the exposure. Choosing any of the 11 shooting modes is as simple as rotating the mode dial, which is divided into 2 parts, the advanced modes and the point-and-shoot modes. The 7 point-and-shoot modes are fully automatic, automatic with the flash disabled, portrait, landscape, close-up, sports, and night portrait. But no matter what they're called, all of these modes are really just slightly different variations of putting the camera on automatic control. So if you don't want to be bothered with thinking about the camera's settings and you're satisfied with shooting snapshots, just turn the dial to any of these modes and start shooting. But I encourage you to think twice before using any of the point-and-shoot modes, because they take too much control out of your hands. Not only do they change the exposure settings, they also override just about every other manual setting on the camera, including white balance, picture control, active D-lighting, the metering mode, and more. But to make matters even worse, in my opinion as a professional photographer, these modes don't even use the best settings for the type of shooting they are supposedly intended for. My advice is to learn to use the advanced modes, because in the long run, you'll become a better photographer for doing so. The 4 advanced shooting modes are Program Auto Exposure, Shutter Priority, Aperture Priority, and Manual Exposure. Once you feel comfortable using the D90, these are the modes you'll want to use as often as you can so you get the very best results. But which of the 4 modes should you use? Well, that depends on what you're shooting. If you're confident in your ability to set your own exposure and you want complete control, choose manual. The manual shooting mode is the only one that gives you full control of shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and flash. It's entirely up to you whether the exposure is good or bad. So I don't recommend this mode unless you are a very experienced photographer. An easier mode to use is aperture priority. If controlling depth of field is important for your picture, choose aperture priority. For example, you'd probably want a small aperture for landscape shooting so that everything is in focus, and a large aperture for shooting a portrait so you can limit the depth of field. My second favorite mode is shutter priority. If controlling the shutter speed is important for your picture, then choose shutter priority. For example, you'd want a fast shutter speed, over 1/1000th of a second for fast-moving action, and a slow shutter speed, under 1 second for special effects like this. However, if you're new to photography, or for times when you don't want to bother tinkering with the camera's exposure settings, you can choose Programmed Auto and let the D90 set the exposure for you. The difference between Programmed Auto and the point-and-shoot modes is that you still have manual control over most of the other advanced settings. I almost always shoot with either aperture priority or shutter priority, so that the camera is giving me some help, but I'm not letting it take over total control. Now, the second part of controlling exposure is to decide which method of metering you want the camera to use. Metering is how the camera analyzes the scene you're shooting and then calculates what the proper exposure should be. There are 3 metering choices on the D90. 3D Color Matrix 2, Center Weighted, and Spot Metering. You can choose to use any of the 3 when you're shooting with one of the 4 advanced exposure modes. But only 3D Color Matrix 2 is available in the point-and-shoot modes. 3D Color Matrix is the most complex metering mode because it analyzes exposure information from all over the frame. And because it works in sync with autofocus, it knows where the subject is situated in the composition, and thus gives that part of the frame priority. This is the best mode to trust for just about everything you shoot. It might not be perfect, but overall it will be very close. Center-weighted metering measures light from the entire frame, but places the greatest emphasis on a circular area in the center. Sometimes it might be an okay choice when the main subject occupies the center part of the frame, but usually you'll be better off with sticking with 3D Color Matrix. Spot metering is an advanced mode that only measures light from a very small area of the frame and ignores everything else in the picture. Because it's so precise, this is the most difficult metering mode to use, and it takes some practice to get it right. So, let's review. We've selected aperture priority as our exposure mode, and 3D Color Matrix as the metering mode. That's probably the combination I use most often, and I could start shooting right now with confidence that most of my shots are going to be properly exposed. However, in some situations, the metering system can be fooled into producing an underexposed, too dark, or an overexposed, too light image. So if you want good results with unusual subjects or in tricky lighting situations, sometimes you'll need to override the automatic exposure settings. There are several controls on the D90 designed for just that purpose. Let's take a quick look at the most important ones. The D90's exposure compensation function is the easiest way to manipulate the exposure settings. By holding down the exposure compensation button and turning the main command dial, you can increase or decrease the exposure. If you select a positive value, the scene will look brighter. If you select a negative value, it will look darker. What you were doing with exposure compensation is letting the camera figure out what it thinks is the right exposure, and then you are telling it to add or subtract a certain amount of light from that value because you don't agree with it. Depending on which shooting mode you're in, the camera will either change the aperture or the shutter speed to let in more or less light. Another easy way to manipulate the exposure setting is with the Auto Exposure Lock button. Now, under normal operation, the camera continually updates the exposure settings whenever the scene appears to get brighter or darker. Most of the time, that's exactly what you want the camera to do. But sometimes you don't want it to change the settings. By holding down the Auto Exposure Lock button, you can freeze the current exposure settings where they are so they won't change when you reframe your shot. You should be warned, though, that with